Hi everyone. Last week we saw that King Arthur's Knights of the Round Table has a firm historical origin in the earliest historical record of King Arthur, the Historia Brittonum, which describes Arthur leading a group of kings into battle against the Saxons. And then in later records, like Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain, we find the same thing but just presented in more detail, with information about who the specific individual kings were. And then in even later records, like the medieval romances, we find the same thing but just presented in an anachronistic way, with anachronistic terminology and an anachronistic style, like the style of a Norman royal court, for example. But the same fundamental thing is still there, the concept of Arthur leading this group of rulers from all over Britain. That concept, which lies at the centre of the concept of the Knights of the Round Table, goes all the way back to the earliest historical source about Arthur. So this week, I wanted to have a look at basically the sequel to that. So not the existence of the Knights of the Round Table, but their downfall. So what can we learn, or what can we say historically about the downfall of the Knights of the Round Table? Well, according to legend, according to the medieval romance tales, this was caused by Mordred, the nephew of Arthur. He was said to have been entrusted with the rulership of Britain for a while Arthur was away, but then he rebelled against Arthur, and he wanted to rule Britain himself, so he caused the civil war, which culminated in the Battle of Camlan. And then, after that, Arthur's alliance of kings, his Knights of the Round Table, fragmented. So that's the story. Now, how does that tie in with what we know historically? Well, the only historical account, or the only contemporary account we have from 6th century Britain is the work of Gilders. So what he has to say about it is very significant. So let's have a look then at something he tells us about the time of the Battle of Badon. Describing that time, he said that kings, public magistrates, and private persons, with priests and clergymen, did all and every one of them live orderly and according to their several vocations. So he doesn't explicitly describe an alliance of kings, but he does tell us that kings and all these other people who had positions of authority all lived orderly and according to their respective positions. That's what he tells us that Britain was like in the time of the Battle of Badon, when the Britons were fighting against the Saxons. But then, after that battle, there was this period of peace that had extended up until at least Gilders' time. And during this peace, Gilders tells us that when a new race succeeded, who were ignorant of this troublesome time when the Britons were fighting the Saxons, and had only experience of the present prosperity, all the laws of truth and justice were so shaken and subverted that not so much as a vestige or remembrance of these virtues remained among the above-named orders of men. So in other words, when the new generation that hadn't experienced the wars against the Saxons, when they grew up, they subverted all the laws of truth and justice, and then Gilders goes on to describe how they started causing civil wars, which were still ongoing in his own time when he was writing. So that's what Gilders tells us historically. Now, how does this relate to the legend of King Arthur? Well, according to the legend of King Arthur, Mordred and his civil war and the Battle of Camlan, that all took place about 20 years or so after the Battle of Badon, which is roughly a generation. But we can get even more specific than that. According to the earliest source that gives any indication of Mordred's age, he was someone who grew up in the generation after Badon. Now, why can we say that? Well, the earliest source that gives any indication of his age is Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britanniae. And I know this isn't an early source, okay, but it's the earliest source which gives any indication of his age. So it's the earliest source that we can use to make any statements about this. Now, according to him, he doesn't comment on Mordred's age. He comments on the age of Mordred's brother, Walgan, better known as Sir Gawain. Now, according to Geoffrey of Monmouth, Walgan was about 12, no, well, he was 12 years old during an event which he places about 13 or maybe 14 years after the Battle of Badon. So this would indicate that Walgan, the brother of Mordred, was born just after, like 1 or 2 years after the Battle of Badon. Now, Geoffrey doesn't say how old Mordred was or what the age difference between him and his brother was. So we can only assume that they were roughly the same age, given that they were brothers. There's no indication of any large age difference between them, and Mordred doesn't appear any earlier in the accounts than this. In fact, he still doesn't appear in the account at this point. He only appears later. So there's no indication of anything that would contradict the idea that he was roughly the same age as Walgan. So that's the most logical conclusion. Now that would mean that Mordred was also someone who grew up in the generation after the Battle of Badon. That's what we can say is the most logical conclusion based on the earliest information that gives any indication about his age. So with that being the case, that would mean that according to the Arthurian legend, the Battle of Camlan and the subsequent downfall and fragmentation of this alliance of kings, or the Knights of the Round Table, was caused by someone who grew up in the generation after the Battle of Badon. Now this is an exact match for what Gilders describes. He described that there was order among those in positions of authority like kings in the generation of the Battle of Badon, and then in the generation that succeeded, they ended up causing civil wars. That is a perfect match for the legend of King Arthur and the downfall of the battle. That is a perfect match for the legend of King Arthur and the downfall of the Knights of the Round Table.